Equality of resources. 1. The auction. In Chapter 1, we considered the claims of equality of welfare as an interpretation of treating people as equals. Here we shall consider the competing claims of equality of resources. But we shall be occupied, for the most part, simply in defining a suitable conception of equality of resources, and not in defending it except as such definition provides a defense. I shall assume, for this purpose, that equality of resources is a matter of equality in whatever resources are owned privately by individuals. Equality of political power, including equality of power over publicly or commonly owned resources, is therefore treated as a different issue, reserved for discussion on another occasion. This distinction is, of course, arbitrary on any number of grounds. From the standpoint of any sophisticated economic theory, an individual's command over public resources forms part of his private resources. Someone who has power to influence public decisions about the quality of the air he or she breathes, for example, is richer than someone who does not. So, an overall theory of equality must find a means of integrating private resources and political power. Private ownership, moreover, is not a single, unique relationship between a person and a material resource, but an open-textured relationship, many aspects of which must be fixed politically. So the question of what division of resources is an equal division must to some degree include the question of what powers someone who is assigned a resource thereby gains, and that in turn must include the further question of his right to veto whatever changes in those powers might be threatened through politics. Here, however, I shall for the most part assume that the general dimensions of ownership are sufficiently well understood that the question of what pattern of private ownership constitutes an equal division of private resources can be discussed independently of these complications. I argue that an equal division of resources presupposes an economic market of some form, mainly as an analytical device, but also, to a certain extent, as an actual political institution. That claim may seem sufficiently paradoxical to justify the following preliminary comments. The idea of a market for goods has figured in political and economic theory since the 18th century in two rather different ways. It has been celebrated, first, as a device for both defining and achieving certain community-wide goals variously described as prosperity, efficiency, and overall utility. It has been hailed, second, as a necessary condition of individual liberty, the condition under which free men and women may exercise individual initiative and choice so that their fates lie in their own hands. The market, that is, has been defended both through arguments of policy, which appeal to the overall community-wide gains it produces, and through arguments of principle, which appeal instead to some supposed right to liberty. But the economic market, whether defended in either or both of these ways, has during the same period come to be regarded as the enemy of equality, largely because the forms of economic market systems developed and enforced in industrial countries have permitted and indeed encouraged vast inequality in property. Both political philosophers and ordinary citizens have therefore pictured equality as the antagonist or victim of the values of efficiency and liberty supposedly served by the market, so that wise and moderate politics consists in striking some balance or trade-off between equality and these other values, either by imposing constraints on the market as an economic environment, or by replacing it, in part or altogether, with a different economic system. I shall try to suggest, on the contrary, that the idea of an economic market as a device for setting prices for a vast variety of goods and services must be at the center of any attractive theoretical development of equality of resources. The main point can be shown most quickly by constructing a reasonably simple exercise in equality of resources, deliberately artificial so as to abstract from problems we shall have to face later. Suppose a number of shipwreck survivors are washed up on a desert island that has abundant resources and no native population, and any likely rescue is many years away. These immigrants accept the principle that no one is antecedently entitled to any of these resources, but that they shall instead be divided equally among them. They do not yet realize, let us say, that it might be wise to keep some resources as owned in common by any state they might create. They also accept, at least provisionally, the following test of an equal division of resources, which I shall call the envy test. No division of resources is an equal division if, once the division is complete, any immigrant would prefer someone else's bundle of resources to his own bundle. T. Foley, Resource Allocation in the Public Sector, Yale Economic Essay 7, Spring. And Varian, Equity, Energy, and Efficiency. Now suppose someone immigrant is elected to achieve the division according to that principle. It is unlikely that he can succeed simply by physically dividing the resources of the island into n identical bundles of resources. The number of each kind of the non-divisible resources, like milking cows, might not be an exact multiple of n, and even in the case of divisible resources, like arable land, some parcels of land would be better than others, and some better for one use than for another. Suppose, however, that by a great deal of trial and error and care the divider could create n bundles of resources, each of which was somewhat different from the others, but was nevertheless such that he could assign one to each immigrant, and no one would in fact envy anyone else's bundle. The distribution might still fail to satisfy the immigrants as an equal distribution for a reason that is not caught by the envy test. Suppose, to put the point in a dramatic way, the divider achieved his result by transforming all the available resources into a very large stock of plover's eggs and pre-phylloxera claret, either by magic or by trade with a neighboring island that enters the story only for that reason, and divides this glut into identical bundles of baskets and bottles. Many of the immigrants, let us say all but one, are delighted. But if that one hates plover's eggs and pre-phylloxera claret, he will feel that he has not been treated as an equal in the division of resources. The envy test is met. He does not prefer anyone's bundle to his own, but he prefers what he would have had under some fair treatment of the initially available resources. A similar, though less dramatic, piece of unfairness might be produced even without magic or bizarre traits. For the combination of resources which composes each bundle the divider creates will favor some tastes over others, compared with different combinations he might have composed. That is, different sets of n bundles might be created by trial and error, each of which would pass the envy test, so that for any such set that the divider chooses, someone will prefer that he had chosen a different set, even though that person would not prefer a different bundle within that set. Trades after the initial distribution may, of course, improve that person's position, but they will be unlikely to bring him to the position he would have had under the set of bundles he would have preferred, because some others will begin with a bundle they prefer to the bundle they would have had in that set, and so will have no reason to trade to that bundle. Allô?
Oui, ça va?
Ça va toi?
J'aurais pas posé ma bague quelque part, c'est quoi?
Je crois pas. Elle est grosse quand même.
Ouais, c'est la grosse mère.
Je vois pas. Non, non, non. Oui.
Ah ouais. Un truc là.
Ah oui, ça, j'aime bien compris. Je vais essayer, là, mais ça m'a pas marché tout à l'heure. Non, je crois pas que c'est vide, non? Je pense pas. C'est encore des ailes. Ah, vraiment, il a disparu. I don't know if that's so much better. Gosh, broken. Ok, bisous. So the divider needs a device that will attack two distinct falsity and arbitrariness and possible unfairness. The envy test cannot be satisfied by any simple mechanical division of resources. If any more complex division can be found that will satisfy it, many such might be found, so that the choices among these would be arbitrary. The same solution will be now have occurred to all readers. The divider needs some form of action or other market procedure in order to respond to these problems. I shall describe a reasonably straightforward procedure that would seem acceptable if it could be made to work, though as I shall describe it would be impossibly expensive of time. Suppose the divider hands each of the immigrants an equal and large number of clamshells, which are sufficiently numerous and in themselves valued by no one, to use as counters in a market of the following sort. Each distinct item on the island, not including the immigrants themselves, is listed as a lot to be sold, unless someone notifies the auctioneer, as the divider has now become, of his or her desire to bid for some part of an item, including part, for example, of some piece of land, in which case that part becomes itself a distinct lot. The auctioneer then proposes a set of prices for each lot and discovers whether that set of prices clears all markets. That is, whether there is only one purchaser at that price and all lots are sold. If not, then the auctioneer adjusts his prices until he reaches a set that does clear the markets. I mean to describe a wool-raisian auction in which all productive resources are sold. I do not assume that the immigrants enter into complete forward contingent claim contracts, but only that markets will remain open and will clear in a wool-raisian fashion once the auction of productive resources is completed. I may call the assumptions about production and preferences made in G. de Broglie theory of value. In fact, the auction I describe here will become more complex in virtue of a tax scheme discussed later. But the process does not stop then, because each of the immigrants remains free to change his bids even when an initially market clearing set of prices is reached, or even to propose different lots. But let us suppose that in time even this leisurely process comes to an end, everyone declares himself satisfied, and goods are distributed accordingly. The process does not guarantee that the auction will come to an end in this way, because there may be various equilibria. I am supposing that people will come to understand that they cannot do better by further runs of the auction, and will for practical reasons settle on one equilibrium. If I am wrong, then this fact provides one of the aspects of incompleteness I describe in the next section. Now the envy test will have been met. No one will envy another set of purchasers because, by hypothesis, he could have purchased that bundle with his clamshells instead of his own bundle. Nor is the choice of sets of bundles arbitrary. Many people will be able to imagine a different set of bundles meeting the no-envy test that might have been established, but the actual set of bundles has the merit that each person played, through his purchases against an initially equal stock of counters, an equal role in determining the set of bundles actually chosen. No one is in the position of the person in our earlier example who found himself with nothing but what he hated. Of course, luck plays a certain role in determining how satisfied anyone is with the outcome against other possibilities he might envision. If Plavazek's and or Tarot were the only resources to auction, then the person who hated these would be as badly off as in our earlier example. He would be unlucky that the immigrants had not washed up on an island with more of what he wanted, though lucky, of course, that it did not have even less, but he could not complain that the division of the actual resources they found was unequal. He might think himself lucky or unlucky in other ways as well. It would be a matter of luck, for example, how many others shared various of his tastes. If his tastes or ambitions proved relatively popular, this circumstance might work in his favor in the auction if there were economies of scale in the production of what he wanted, or against him if what he wanted was scarce. If the immigrants had decided to establish a regime of equality of welfare instead of equality of resources, then these various pieces of good or bad luck would be shared with others because distribution would be based not on any auction of the sort I've described, in which luck plays this role, but on a strategy of evening out differences in whatever concept of welfare had been chosen. Equality of resources, however, offers no similar reason for correcting for the contingencies that determine how expensive or frustrating someone's preferences turn out to be. See, however, the discussion of handicaps below, which recognizes that certain kinds of preferences, which people wish they did not have, may call for compensation as handicaps. Under equality of welfare, people are meant to decide what sorts of lives they want independently of information relevant to determining how much their choices will reduce or enhance the ability of others to have what they want. That sort of information becomes relevant only at the second, political level at which administrators then gather all the choices made at the first level to see what distribution will give each of these choices equal success under some concept of welfare taken as the correct dimension of success. Under equality of resources, however, people decide what sorts of lives to pursue against a background of information about the actual cost their choices impose on other people, and hence on the total stock of resources that may fairly be used by them. The information left to an independent political level under equality of welfare is therefore brought to the initial level of individual choice under equality of resources. The elements of luck in the auction just described are in fact pieces of information of a crucial sort, information that is acquired and used in that process of choice. So the contingent facts of raw material and the distribution of tastes are not grounds on which someone might challenge distribution as unequal. There are rather background facts that determine what equality of resources in these circumstances is. Under equality of resources, no test for calculating what equality requires can be abstracted from these background facts and used to test them. The market character of the auction is not simply a convenient or ad hoc device for resolving technical problems that arise for equality of resources in very simple exercises like our desert island case. It is an institutionalized form of the process of discovery and adaptation that is at the center of the ethics of that idea. Equality of resources supposes that the resources devoted to each person's life should be equal. That goal needs a metric. The auction proposes what the envy test in fact assumes, that the true measure of the social resources devoted to the life of one person is fixed by asking how important, in fact, that resource is for others. It insists that the cost measured in that way figures in each person's sense of what is rightly his and in each person's judgment of what life he should lead, given that command of justice. Anyone who insists that equality is violated by any particular profile of initial tastes, therefore, must reject equality of resources and fall back on equality of welfare. Of course, it is sovereign in this argument, and in this connection between the market and equality of resources, that people enter the market on equal terms. The desert island auction would not have avoided envy and would have no appeal as a solution to the problem of dividing the resources equally if the immigrants had struggled ashore with different amounts of money in their pockets. which they were free to use in the auction, or if some had stolen clamshells from others. We must not lose sight of that fact, either in the argument that follows or in any reflections on the application of that argument to contemporary economic systems. But neither should we lose sight, in our dismay over the iniquities of those systems, of the important theoretical connection between the market and the concept of equality of resources. There are, of course, other and very different sorts of objection that might be made to the use of an auction, even an equal auction of the sort I described. It might be said, for example, that the fairness of an auction supposes that the preferences people bring to the auction of form in its course are authentic, the true preferences of the agent rather than preferences imposed upon him by the economic system itself. Perhaps an auction of any sort, in which one person bids against another, imposes an illegitimate assumption that what is valuable in life is individual ownership of something rather than more cooperative enterprises of the community or some group within it as a whole. Insofar as this, in part mysterious, objection is present here, however, it is an objection against the idea of private ownership over an extensive domain of resources, which is better considered under the title of political equality, not an objection to the claim that a market of some sort must figure in any satisfactory account of what equality in private ownership is. To the project, ce sera plus tard.